Born in Szczecin, on the banks of the Oder River in northwestern what is now Poland in August 1901, SS-Oberst-Gruppenführer Hans Kammler was, according to contemporary accounts, one of the most ruthless and ingenious hierarchs of the Nazi regime. Kammler awakened his passion for the military field in 1919, when he voluntarily enlisted in the German army and began serving in the Freikorps Rossbach, one of the many improvised troops that, after World War I, began to integrate former Reichswehr veterans. That same year, he began studying engineering in Munich and Danzig, obtaining his doctorate at the end of 1932. Just a year earlier, in the autumn of 1931, after contributing to the fight against the communist blocs for control of the increasingly unstable Weimar Republic, Kammler decided to join the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Once inside the Nazi party ranks, he developed a meteoric career towards power. By the winter of 1933, Kammler was already part of the SS. At the beginning of the 1940s, immediately after being assigned to the SS Wirtschafts- und Verwaltungshauptamt, Kammler became a collaborator of Oswald Pohl, the chief administrator of the Nazi concentration camps. From his new position, Kammler suggested a new and harrowing solution to the problem of overcrowding in the camps: the construction of enormous crematory buildings. On September 26, 1941, just days after the announcement of the plan designed for Majdanek, Kammler ordered the construction of the largest extermination center ever seen in Auschwitz, about 43 kilometers west of Krakow, where approximately 1,300,000 people would be sent. Its construction took longer than planned, and on December 19, 1941, Kammler had to communicate with Himmler to update him on the situation. The slow progress, both in Auschwitz and in Majdanek, was due, according to him, to the low temperatures, lack of materials, and insufficient labor. To speed up the process, Kammler, in his capacity as a member of the WVHA, was intimately involved in all major construction projects related to the extermination camps. Finally, by late March 1942, the mass deportation of Jews to Majdanek and Auschwitz began. In August 1943, after the Royal Air Force successfully bombed the Peenemünde rocket production complex through the so-called Operation Hydra, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production Albert Speer recommended continuing arms production clandestinely. Hitler immediately agreed with Speer, and both decided that the SS, with its vast labor supply, was best suited to carry out the task. Kammler was selected to oversee the project. He quickly took charge of moving all production to underground hideouts, forming the Mittelwerk complex, camouflaged in the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, and overseeing the construction of more facilities in Jonestal, Karkonosze, and Ebensee. It is estimated that of the 20,000 people who died in Mittelbau-Dora, approximately 10,000 did so due to the inhumane working conditions imposed by Kammler in the development of missiles. Speer even came to fear him and placed him among the most cruel and ruthless henchmen of Himmler. By the end of the war, the extensive hierarchy of the Third Reich had already begun to collapse, and power was concentrating in fewer individuals. In March 1944, Himmler persuaded Hitler to put the V2 project directly under SS control. On August 8th, Kammler took command of the project, replacing Walter Dornberger. At the beginning of the following year, Hitler appointed Kammler head of all missile projects, but due to a lack of supplies, the program was nearing its end by then. In March 1945, Hitler stripped Hermann Göring, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, of his powers over aircraft maintenance and supply, transferring these functions to Kammler. This culminated in Kammler's appointment as General Plenipotentiary of the Führer in early April. Thus, Kammler consolidated his place as one of the most important Nazi hierarchs while the regime crumbled around him. Facing the relentless advance of the Allied forces into Germany, Kammler began moving from place to place, trying not to abandon his projects and fleeing not only from Allied soldiers but also from his superiors, whom he increasingly disobeyed. During his flight, Kammler became even more paranoid and ruthless. At the end of March 1945, amid the evacuation of V2 missiles, he ordered the execution of more than 200 workers along with their families after his car was detained on a road in Sauerland, in what would come to be known as the Arnsberg Forest Massacre. On April 1st, the forces under his command were called to join the German infantry, and Kammler ordered the evacuation of hundreds of engineers and scientists to the Nazi Alpine fortress. Since the last V-2 missile had been launched by the end of March on April 5th, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht tasked Kammler with the defense of the Nordhausen area. However, Kammler disobeyed the order, and his movements from then on became extremely elusive for posterity. Wholeheartedly committed to the Nazi cause, Kammler saw no contradiction between Hitler's notions of blood and soil and the modern scientific and technological methods he had studied and learned during his youth. His goal, on the contrary, was to put these methods at the Nazis' disposal, believing that National Socialism was a sort of necessary catalyst for the development of modernity. For Kammler, modern concepts of science and technology and the ideas associated with German supremacy were ultimately intertwined. In Kammler's figure, technological competence and Nazi fanaticism coexisted in perfect harmony. The shadow of chaos, the mysterious last days of Hans Kammler. The final days of Hans Kammler's life are extremely confusing and at times contradictory. According to reports largely compiled by British and American forces, Kammler managed to survive the Royal Air Force attacks on the Nordhausen area, drove with what remained of his team to a safe location, and arrived in Munich on April 13th to meet with Speer. After the meeting, Kammler hid in Linderhof Palace, located in a valley near the village of Oberammergau, where the Messerschmitt 262 jet factory was located, close to an extensive SS underground hideout where it is believed he either hid, or perhaps destroyed, hundreds of classified documents containing valuable information about the technological developments of the Nazi regime. By late April, he traveled to Avon, Austria, near a concentration camp behind which was an underground weapons storage facility. According to some testimonies, Kammler might have also stayed at Villa Mendelssohn in Ebensee, the site of one of the projects assigned to him, and ordered the immediate transfer of the Ebensee office to Prague. At the beginning of May, after Hitler committed suicide in the Führerbunker and his body was burned in the Reich Chancellery garden, and just days before the final surrender of the regime, Kammler departed for the capital of Czechoslovakia, which was still under German control. However, he and his driver, Kurt Preuck, deviated from the main convoy halfway, and their trail was lost from then on. The last news about Kammler was received by British forces on May 7th, when the Nazi leader attempted to send a message to a surviving SS group. However, the British could not pinpoint his whereabouts, and Hans Kammler's life was shrouded in darkness from that moment on. Since then, theories have proliferated. Some say Kammler eventually arrived in Prague only to find that the local population had risen against the German occupation. Amid the chaos, Kammler was reportedly shot in the left leg and after being taken to a hospital was killed by Czech partisans who stormed the building. However, records show that a senior German army sergeant named Friedrich Baum entered an Austrian military hospital in late May with a wound and a similar story, only to die of an infection a week later. Some have speculated that this was actually Kammler, who might have stolen a military uniform and assumed Baum's identity. Others say Kammler and 21 SS men defended a German bunker against an attack by hundreds of Czech resistance fighters on May 9th, and that during the attack, one of Kammler's aides shot him to prevent his capture. Other theories suggest a possible suicide. Some of Kammler's associates claimed that the Führer's plenipotentiary had escaped to Ebensee, which would align with his stay at Villa Mendelssohn just a few weeks earlier, to be with his wife, and that once there, he ended his life by shooting himself or taking cyanide pills. In an affidavit, Preuck stated that Kammler's date of death was around May 10th, but he did not know the cause of his death. Heinz Zeuner, Kammler's war aide, however, claimed that his death occurred a few days earlier, on May 7th, and that he, along with Preuck, had buried the body in an anonymous grave. By the mid-20th century, like many other stories from World War II, Kammler's began to be intertwined with the conflicts between the United States and the Soviet Union. The theories surrounding his death were refuted by a US counterintelligence agent named Oskar Packer, who claimed that Kammler was captured by the Americans in mid-May at the Messerschmitt factory in Oberammergau, but managed to escape shortly afterward and headed to eastern Germany, where he began working secretly for Soviet intelligence. Some believe that the theories about his journey to Prague are merely attempts to cover up his escape to Soviet-occupied areas where the Americans could not conduct a proper investigation into his whereabouts. Donald W. Richardson, a former OSS special agent involved in Operation Alsos, a plan under the Manhattan Project aimed at recovering German nuclear research files and verifying the extent of Nazi efforts to create an atomic bomb, claimed to be the man who escorted Kammler to the United States. Shortly before his death, Richardson allegedly told his children about his experiences during and after the war. According to them, Richardson had monitored Kammler until 1947, when he was supposedly interned in a maximum security prison, where he was brutally punished during interrogations until he eventually hanged himself. However, there is no evidence to corroborate this hypothesis. Finally, on July 9, 1945, Kammler's wife requested that he be declared dead and provided Preuck's statement as evidence. 3 years later, on September 7, 1948, the Berlin Charlottenburg District Court ruled that Kammler's death officially occurred on May 9, 1945. Both Preuck and Zeuner maintained their versions of the events. Letters sent by Ingeborg Alex von Oldenburg, a female member of the SS Helferinnenkorps, to Kammler's wife between 1951 and 1955 seemed to partially support the official version. In these letters, she claimed that Kammler had said goodbye to her on May 7, 1945 in Prague, stating that the Americans were pursuing him, that they had made offers which he had rejected, and that he would not be captured alive. Despite all these theories, the final fate of Hans Kammler, one of the most ruthless Nazi leaders, remains shrouded in mystery. The legacy of the Wunderwaffen, technologies that challenged the fate of the war. After the failure of Operation Barbarossa and the entry of the United States into World War II, Germany's strategic situation changed as the Nazi regime was unprepared for a long-term war. The conflict began to increasingly turn against the Nazis, and Hitler decided to focus on creating a series of technological innovations and advanced weapons, designed in the hope of altering the course of the war in Germany's favor. The collection of weapons and war devices created from then on was given the name Wunderwaffe. Among the most important innovations were the Hortenho 229, a jet combat aircraft with a delta wing design, intended to be more stealthy and aerodynamic, which never went into mass production but influenced the design of stealth aircraft in the post-war era. The Panzer VIII Maus, a super-heavy tank that, although designed to be unstoppable on the battlefield, only a few prototypes were completed and never used in combat. The Landkreuzer P-1000 Ratte, a gigantic assault tank that, if completed, would have been the largest armored vehicle ever built, but only prototypes were constructed and never mass-produced. The U-Boot 21, a Class 21 submarine that represented a significant advance in submarine technology, with greater speed and range while submerged. The Heinkel He-162, a jet fighter designed to be rapidly produced with simple materials, and although it was one of the first jet aircraft in combat, its performance and effectiveness were limited due to production and development problems. However, the main innovations created by Nazi engineers and technicians were undoubtedly the V-2 rockets and the Messerschmitt Me 262, which will be discussed in more detail later. On the other hand, there were much more ambitious and extravagant projects that never made it past the theoretical stage. The Sonnengewehr is probably the best example. The Nazi regime aimed to build a satellite equipped with a massive parabolic mirror that would concentrate sunlight into a devastating beam capable of incinerating entire cities from space. This weapon was glorified by many SS leaders and the Todt Organization in their religious ceremonies, believing it would be the way to deliver the final blow to all enemies of the Third Reich. Another device that underwent testing was the sonic cannon. Designed in early 1940 by Dr. Richard Walauschek, this cannon consisted of two parabolic reflectors connected by several tubes forming a firing chamber. Through the tubes, a mixture of oxygen and methane was introduced into the chamber, which was cyclically detonated, and the sound waves produced by the explosions generated a high-intensity shock wave, creating a sonic beam of enormous amplitude. However, these devices were never employed in combat, and there are serious doubts about their possible functionality. The Wunderwaffen were largely a mix of technological innovations and propaganda. Despite their potential, many of these weapons faced serious technical, logistical, and production problems that limited their effectiveness. The reality is that, although some of these weapons were technologically advanced, they did not significantly alter the balance of power in the war, mainly due to a lack of resources and the late stage at which they were introduced. The term Wunderwaffe was used by the Nazi regime to keep morale high and create the impression that Germany possessed secret technologies that could change the course of the war. In truth, the capabilities of these weapons were often exaggerated to maintain enthusiasm and hope among the German population and armed forces. In this sense, the Wunderwaffen represented the Nazi regime's desperate effort to surpass its enemies through advanced technology. Furthermore, the production of these weapons often involved the use of forced labor under inhumane conditions, with thousands of prisoners of war and civilians suffering and dying in the factories. In reality, the advanced weapons the Nazi regime tried to develop generally required long periods of design and testing, and there were no realistic prospects that the German army could deploy them before the war ended. Today, it is considered that the ultimate result of all these weapons, whether deployed or not, was that the Third Reich wasted a great deal of money and technical knowledge and killed many forced and slave workers in the development and production of exotic devices that provided little or no tactical and strategic advantage to their war effort. Although many of the Wunderwaffen were not decisive in World War II, their development and the technological principles they incorporated influenced military engineering and weapon development in the post-war era, and some designs have even had applications and developments in modern military technologies. Once the war ended, many of the German scientists and engineers who worked on developing the Wunderwaffen were captured and brought to the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, where they continued working on advanced technology programs. Their experience and knowledge were crucial for the development of programs emerging in the post-war context of the Cold War and the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as other military technologies. The V-2, the pinnacle of Nazi technology and the prelude to the space race. In the mid-1930s, the vast majority of the Nazi regime's technological programs were focused on building a large artillery rocket, the A-4. To achieve this, design features and various control techniques were tested using a scaled-down model called the A-5. By late 1941, the A-4 was complete, and the first test was conducted on June 13, 1942. However, the rocket failed to lift off and crashed to the ground. The second test, launched on August 16th, flew for a few seconds before beginning to oscillate and eventually breaking apart in the air. The third test, conducted on October 3rd, was the first to complete a successful flight, reaching an altitude of 5 kilometers and falling 190 kilometers away. Enthusiastic about the project's success, Hitler ordered the mass production of the A-4 under the name Vergeltungswaffe II, or simply Vi-2, intended primarily to attack London. The V-2 was the world's first long-range ballistic missile and the first human-made object to reach the edge of outer space. It was developed under the direction of engineer Werner von Braun, one of the most important rocket designers of the 20th century, and the chief scientist of the Third Reich's rocket program. Work on the V-2 began in the mid-1930s, with the first tests conducted on the island of Peenemünde in the Baltic Sea. The V-2 rocket was designed as a retaliatory weapon to attack Allied cities in response to bombings over Germany. It was powered by a liquid-fuel rocket engine using a mixture of ethanol and liquid oxygen as propellants, capable of reaching speeds of up to 5,760 kilometers per hour and had a range of approximately 320 kilometers. The first operational use of the V-2 occurred on September 8, 1944, when a rocket was launched at Paris, followed by another that hit London. Throughout the war, approximately 5,000 V-2 rockets were launched, primarily targeting locations in the United Kingdom, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Although the V-2 caused significant destruction in target cities, particularly London and Antwerp, it was not a decisive weapon for the war, mainly due to its high production cost, limited accuracy, and the fact that as a successor to the V-1, a cruise missile, it only appeared in mid-1944 when the war had already taken a decisive turn towards Allied victory. Despite this, the V2 represented one of the most significant advances in weapon technology achieved up to that point. Unlike the V1, the V2 was invulnerable. It reached astonishing speeds that even the fastest fighters of the time could not intercept, and anti-aircraft artillery could not shoot it down. Furthermore, because they were launched from mobile bases, it was extremely difficult to locate their position. The altitude and speed reached by the V2 made it virtually impossible to detect with the radar technology of the time. Although the missile could be seen by Allied pilots at the moment of launch, who then had complete control of the skies, no fighter was able to stop a V2 launch. It seemed that the Germans had created a weapon against which there was no defense. On the other hand, the mass production of the V2 involved the use of forced labor, mostly prisoners from concentration camps, under extremely harsh and dangerous conditions. The underground factories designed by Kammler, such as Mittelwerk, where the rockets were assembled, were scenes of terrible suffering, with thousands of prisoners dying due to the inhumane working conditions they endured. Nevertheless, the V2 ultimately marked a milestone in the history of rocket technology and served as a precursor to intercontinental ballistic missiles and post-war space programs. The technology used in its construction was the foundation upon which space programs were built, through which the United States and the Soviet Union would compete in the emerging Cold War context following the definitive fall of the Nazi regime. The Messerschmitt, Me-262, the reaction that came too late. Although the attention of the Nazi regime's scientists and engineers was primarily focused on designing and building artillery rockets, they also worked on other projects. The most important of these was undoubtedly the Messerschmitt Me-262, nicknamed the Schwalbe, the world's first jet fighter to enter service. Development of the Me-262 began in 1938, shortly before the outbreak of World War II, under the direction of Willy Messerschmitt. Originally, the aircraft was conceived as a piston-engine fighter, but in 1939 the decision was made to adapt it for jet engines, a technology that was then in its early stages of development. The Me-262 made its first flight in early 1942, although it was equipped with a piston engine due to issues with the jet engines. The first flight with fully operational jet engines took place in July of the same year. The Me-262 was powered by two Junkers Jumo 004 jet engines, giving it a maximum speed of approximately 870 kilometers per hour, much faster than any piston-engine aircraft in service at that time. It was armed with four 30mm Mk-108 automatic cannons, making it a formidable threat to Allied bombers. It could also carry bombs, allowing it to be used as a fighter bomber. Additionally, the Me-262 featured a highly innovative swept-wing design for its time, which helped improve its aerodynamic performance at high speeds. The Me-262's combat debut occurred on July 25, 1944, marking a significant milestone in military history. Lieutenant Alfred Schreiber first engaged in combat with a Me-262 by intercepting a British Mosquito piloted by Lieutenant A.E. Wall, who was on a reconnaissance mission over Munich. Wall attempted to evade using the Mosquito's traditional power, but to his surprise, his opponent approached relentlessly. Wall eventually managed to escape, but ended up crashing while attempting to land in Fermo. That day, Schreiber demonstrated the capabilities of jet aircraft, thus setting an unavoidable precedent in aviation history. Although the technicians and engineers working for the Nazi regime believed that the Me-262 had the potential to change the course of the air war, which had been dominated by the Allied forces up to that point, its production and operational deployment were hindered by several factors, including technical problems with the engines, material shortages, and strategic missteps. One of these mistakes was Hitler's insistence on using the Me-262 as a bomber instead of a fighter. By the end of the war, approximately 1,400 Me-262s had been manufactured, but only 300 could be used simultaneously due to the aforementioned problems. Like the V2, the Me-262 did not enter combat until mid-1944, by which time the war was already leaning in favor of the Allies. Despite the confidence of German technicians and engineers and its unmatched speed and powerful armament, which was even superior to that of Allied fighters, the Me-262 had some weaknesses that the enemy forces did not hesitate to exploit. Among these weaknesses were the inability to perform tight turns, and the delay in reducing approach speed for landing, along with the need for a long runway for takeoff. This made it very vulnerable during these operational phases, and Allied pilots quickly developed tactics to counter the Me-262's attacks, such as ambushing it during takeoff or landing when it was defenseless. This forced German airbase commanders to surround their bases with anti-aircraft artillery belts and create specific squadrons of Bf-109 and Fw-190 aircraft for the protection of the Me-262. The critical shortage of production resources, trained pilots, and fuel that Germany faced towards the end of the war contributed to forcing the operation of fighter units from makeshift bases along the Autobahn, Germany's main highway, where a large number of abandoned Me-262s were found at the end of the war. Despite these difficulties, the Me-262 managed to shoot down a significant number of Allied aircraft, demonstrating the immense potential of jet aircraft. The Me-262 ultimately marked the beginning of the jet age and had a significant influence on the design of combat aircraft in the decades that followed. Many of the design principles and technologies used in the Me-262 were adopted and improved upon in post-war aircraft. Architects of Destruction, the Todt Organization in Nazi Germany. At the beginning of the 1940s, as the war began to tilt in favor of the Allied forces, Hitler ordered that the vast majority of Nazi institutions be dedicated exclusively to the war effort. The Todt Organization, a civil engineering entity founded in 1933 by Fritz Todt, a civil engineer and party member, became an essentially paramilitary organization. Its projects, which had until then been focused primarily on constructing highways, bridges, and defensive structures in German territory, shifted towards the production of weaponry and infrastructure for the concentration and extermination camps designed by Kammler. The Todt Organization was responsible for the construction of the highway network in Germany. This was one of the first major projects of the Nazi regime and was promoted as a symbol of progress and modernization under Hitler's leadership. However, over time, the enormous increase in demand for labor for various military and paramilitary projects, combined with a series of laws promoted by the German government urging the entire population to enlist in the army or perform various jobs for the regime, allowed the Todt Organization to recruit nearly 2 million German workers. The organization eventually became directly dependent on high-ranking military officers and played a very active role during World War II. It expanded rapidly and took on a crucial role in building military fortifications. It was involved in the construction of defensive structures such as the Siegfried Line on Germany's western border, designed to defend against a possible invasion, and the Atlantic Wall, an extensive line of fortifications stretching along the western coast of Europe from Norway to the Spanish border. The Todt Organization was composed of a small number of advisors, mostly engineers and technicians, who answered to the armed forces. Beneath them were steel industry magnates such as Alfred Krupp, Wilhelm Flick, Hugo Stinners, and below them, a vast number of foreign workers. The Todt Organization was also involved in the construction of concentration camps and the extensive use of slave labor. It is estimated that over 1.5 million people, including prisoners of war and forced laborers from occupied territories, were exploited by the organization under extremely harsh conditions. Fritz Todt died in a mysterious plane crash in 1942 in the city of Frankfurt. This, like the final fate of Kammler, gave rise to many conspiracy theories. After his death, Albert Speer, who was already deeply involved in the organization as Minister of Armaments, took control of the Todt Organization. Under his leadership, the organization further expanded its activities, contributing significantly to the Nazi war effort, but also intensifying the use of slave labor. After the collapse of the Third Reich, the organization was dissolved. Many of its leaders, including Speer, were tried at the Nuremberg trials for war crimes and crimes against humanity, mainly due to the use of slave labor in concentration camps and in the factories often hidden beneath them, as well as the inhumane conditions to which they were subjected. The infrastructure built by the Todt Organization, such as highways and some fortifications, endured after the war, although the more sinister aspects of its legacy, such as its brutal exploitation of forced laborers, eventually became the subject of study and condemnation. By the end of the war, the organization's power and influence had grown immensely, and it is estimated that by 1944, Between 25 and 30% of German war production came from factories managed by the organization, employing directly and indirectly over 3 million workers. Although the crash was officially attributed to technical failures, the fact that Todt was on a private flight and not on an official mission has raised doubts. Todt was a high-ranking official in the Nazi regime and a close collaborator of Hitler. Additionally, his death occurred at a time when the regime was ramping up the production of armaments and fortifications. Some theories suggest that his death might have been the result of internal conflicts within the regime or a conspiracy, as it allowed Albert Speer, who had been partially displaced by Kammler, to take control of the Todt Organization and armament policies. Speer was known for his ambition and close ties to Hitler, leading to speculation about possible motives for his rise to power. The lack of definitive information and the surrounding circumstances have made Fritz Todt's death a topic of ongoing debate and speculation in the history of World War II. The Uranium Project, Hitler's failed nuclear dream. In December 1938, in an old laboratory in Berlin, German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, along with Jewish physicist Lise Meitner, discovered nuclear fission and decided to publish their findings in the journal Naturwissenschaften. Early the following year, Meitner, persecuted by the Nazis, was forced to leave the country, first fleeing to the Netherlands and later to Sweden, where she and her nephew, Otto Frisch, confirmed the results of their discovery. Shortly afterward, in April 1939, Paul Hartek, director of the Department of Physics and Chemistry at the University of Hamburg and advisor to the German army, contacted members of the Third Reich leadership to warn them about the military implications of the discovery. The regime immediately halted the export of uranium and formed a committee tasked with studying the practical uses of a sustained nuclear chain reaction. After its first meeting, the committee adopted the name Uranium Club. Just 5 months later, in September 1939, in the context of the German invasion of Poland and driven by the Waffenamt, the Nazi regime launched the Uranium Project, equivalent to the Manhattan Project developed by the United States. Over time, the project focused on 3 main activities: the development of a nuclear reactor, the production of uranium and heavy water, and the separation of uranium isotopes. The Uranium Project, however, faced several difficulties. By mid-1942, German military officials realized that the program had involved an excessive investment and had not yielded the expected results, so they decided to cut its funding and transfer it to the Reichsforschungsrat. Economic problems were beginning to plague the regime by then, and funds allocated to nuclear research became increasingly scarce. The project eventually dwindled to a decentralized network of isolated researchers with vastly different research programs who fiercely competed for the scarce resources the regime could provide. On the other hand, when the Allied forces learned of the project's existence, they began bombing the Nazis' heavy water plants, a highly specialized liquid used to cool nuclear reactors, and even organized commando missions to destroy the heavy water shipments that had survived the bombings. To avoid this, the Nazis decided to move the facilities to unconventional and safer locations. The famous physicist Werner Heisenberg, director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, had to relocate to the basement of a church in Haigerloch, where he and his team built an experimental nuclear reactor made of uranium cubes suspended on a wire and immersed in large tanks of heavy water. Despite Heisenberg's efforts, the reactor never worked. The American and British forces also deployed secret espionage missions as part of Operation Alsos, which was itself part of the Manhattan Project. Hitler's nuclear ambitions were also thwarted by his own actions. In the mid-1930s, the Nazi Party's constant interference in the German academic world had driven many physicists, engineers, and mathematicians out of the country. Jewish scientists who did not leave were quickly purged, further reducing the ranks of researchers. Additionally, the German military's constant demand for manpower led to the recruitment of much of the skilled personnel, despite their lack of military knowledge, which significantly reduced the number of available researchers. Finally, although it was intended for members of the Luftwaffe to conduct advanced research at an army test site, the Uranium Project remained confined to laboratories, with the relatively modest goal of building a nuclear reactor that could sustain a chain reaction for a significant amount of time and achieve the complete separation of at least some uranium isotopes. But the truth is that this goal was never achieved, and despite the fears spread at the time, the Germans were never really close to producing nuclear weapons. With the end of the war in the spring of 1945, several Allied powers competed to obtain personnel, facilities, and surviving materials from the German nuclear industry. The vast majority of the scientists involved in the project were captured and sent to Farm Hall in England through Operation Epsilon, organized by British forces, where the English secretly recorded the German scientists in the hope of uncovering secrets about the Nazi nuclear projects. The Americans seized most of the materials and managed to collect several tons of uranium-235, the only isotope naturally capable of causing a nuclear fission chain reaction. The Soviet Union, for its part, managed to collect uranium and heavy water and recruit some German scientists. Today, it is believed that the Nazi regime, in the end, was never truly close to building the atomic bomb. The reasons for this are, however, a subject of debate, as they are linked not only to the lack of resources and operational deficiencies that plagued the regime towards the end of the 80s war, but also to ethical issues, as it is not precisely known whether the scientists and engineers who worked for the Nazis were ultimately in favor of or against the regime led by Hitler. The hidden treasures of the Third Reich, Operation Paperclip and the battle for German knowledge. After the fall of the Nazi regime in the spring of 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a fierce and covert struggle for control over the scientific and technological advances of Nazi Germany, particularly in the fields of military industry, especially aeronautics and chemistry. The United States carried out Operation Paperclip for this purpose, a mission designed by the U.S. intelligence service to recruit hundreds of German scientists, engineers, and technicians who had worked for the Third Reich in key areas such as aeronautics, chemistry, and rocket development. Initially called Operation Overcast, the mission eventually adopted the name Operation Paperclip due to the practice of American agents marking the files of selected scientists with a paperclip. In the spring of 1943, the Nazi regime began recruiting scientists and technicians from combat units to start developing new weapons and military devices. All those with a doctorate or master's degree in the exact sciences were immediately released from military service. This effort, which required tracking down personnel qualified for the task and investigating their private lives to determine their loyalty to the regime, culminated in the creation of the Osenberg list. In March 1945, a Polish technician found the remnants of the list amidst the rubble. Major Robert B. Staver, a member of American intelligence, used it to create the Black List, the code name for the list of rocket experts that the intelligence service used to deploy the operation. Initially, while the mission was still under the code name Operation Overcast, Staver's original intention was only to interview the scientists. However, after hearing what he did during these interviews, he changed the operation's purpose, and on May 22nd, he sent a telegram to the U.S. War Department urging the evacuation of 100 German scientists who were under his custody. Although most of them surrendered to the American forces, Staver was concerned about the possibility that some of the scientists might emigrate and continue their research in other countries. To prevent this, he arranged to abduct all those who did not surrender voluntarily. Much of these efforts were focused on Saxony and Thuringia, which would become part of the Soviet occupation zone on July 1st. Many German research facilities and personnel had been evacuated to these states, especially from Berlin. Fearing that Soviet control would limit the USAID's ability to exploit German scientific and technical knowledge, the United States deployed an evacuation plan for scientific personnel from Saxony and Thuringia. In total, more than 1,800 technicians and scientists and 3,700 of their family members were secretly brought to the United States. Those with special knowledge or skills were taken to detention centers for interrogation, in some cases for months. Many of them were relocated to small towns in the countryside or the desert, where there were no research facilities or workplaces. They were provided with stipends and required to report twice a week to the police headquarters to prevent them from leaving. The government established that technicians and scientists would only be released after all interested agencies were satisfied that they had obtained all the desired intelligence from them. Many of the German scientists and technicians recruited by the United States government had been members of the Nazi Party, or had directly participated in projects that contributed to the war effort of the Third Reich, including some conducted in facilities where slave labor was used. Despite this, in the emerging context of the Cold War, the priority for the United States was to ensure that their talent did not fall into Soviet hands. Therefore, US forces decided to clean up the records of most of them, omitting or minimizing their backgrounds. In total, it is estimated that Operation Paperclip involved over 6,000 people, considered part of the intellectual reparations that Germany was to pay to the United States and Great Britain. Considering the patents and industrial processes involved, it is estimated that the value of these reparations was around $10 billion. One of the most important objectives of Operation Paperclip was the acquisition of the German rocket program, especially those related to the V-2 ballistic missiles. Werner von Braun, the chief designer of the V-2 rocket, was one of the most prominent recruits. In the context of the emerging space race between the United States and the Soviet Union, von Braun and his team were relocated to North America, where they played a crucial role in the development of the US space program, including the Apollo program, which led to the first manned moon landing. Ultimately, Operation Paperclip made a decisive contribution to the development of US military and space technology in the post-war era. However, although it was highly effective from a technical and strategic point of view, its history raises uncomfortable questions about the ethical compromises and decisions made in the context of the Cold War. Many of the technological and scientific projects developed by the United States were, ultimately, based on programs designed by the Nazi regime to carry out its plan of expansion and extermination. Behind the Iron Curtain, Operation Osoaviakhim and the other side of the race for German knowledge. In October 1946, just a year after the end of World War II, the Soviet Union decided to counteract US influence by creating Operation Osoaviakhim, whose primary objective was the recruitment of thousands of scientists, engineers, and technicians from the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany and their transfer to the Soviet Union. Just as the US forces had done through Operation Paperclip, the Soviet Union sought to capitalize on the technical and scientific knowledge of German scientists and technicians, ensuring that Germany's scientific and technical capabilities did not fall solely into American hands. Immediately after the war, under Soviet supervision, experimental design offices were established in the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany. By early 1946, some of these had grown into large development enterprises. The strategic and military importance of these companies led to conflicts with the other Allied forces, prompting some Communist Party leaders to consider the possibility of relocating them to the Soviet Union. Although this possibility was rejected by certain sectors of the Soviet leadership, Stalin decided in early April to transfer the material and specialized personnel to the country. The operation was directed by the NKVD, with support from Osoaviakhim, a Soviet paramilitary organization. On the night of October 22, 1946, Soviet forces arrested more than 2,000 German specialists, along with their families, in the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany. Thousands of scientists and technicians were transferred by train and cargo planes to various research and development facilities in the Soviet Union, where they continued working under the supervision of different Communist Party members. Like the Americans, the Soviets were extremely interested in the rocket technology developed by the Germans and planned to use it to launch their own missile program. The German scientists contributed significantly to the Soviet rocket program, which eventually led to the launch of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, in 1957. Additionally, the captured German experts worked on a wide range of industrial and military projects, including aircraft development, radar technology, and the production of advanced weaponry. Their expertise helped accelerate several key programs in the Soviet Union during the early years of the Cold War. The Soviet Union also launched the Russian Alsos project, equivalent to the Alsos operation developed by Britain and the United States, an operation that took place in early 1945 in Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, with the main goal of exploiting facilities related to atomic research, acquiring resources, and recruiting scientific personnel to accelerate the USSR's atomic project, using information sent by spies infiltrated in the Manhattan Project. Like its American counterpart, Operation Osoaviakhim was a strategic success for the Soviet Union, as it allowed the Soviets to gain a considerable advantage in several scientific and technological fields. However, many of the German specialists who remained in the USSR and significantly contributed to Soviet advances did so under conditions of harassment. Under the threat of reprisals, specialists and their families were prohibited from sending or delivering written documents. From an ethical standpoint, the operation was highly controversial, as it involved the forced relocation of thousands of people without their consent. The German scientists, technicians and workers were assigned to both individual projects and work groups, primarily in the areas of aeronautics and rocket technology, nuclear research, chemistry and optics. These projects lasted approximately 5 years, and the researchers were allowed to return to Germany between 1951 and 1958, having to keep their years in the Soviet Union a secret. Those who settled in the German Democratic Republic received preferential treatment. Some obtained university professorships, and others became public officials. In the broader context of the Cold War, Operation Osoaviakhim reflected the fierce competition between the United States and the Soviet Union for control of science and technology. The dark side of innovation. Conclusions about the technology developed by the Nazi regime. In summary, the Nazi regime designed a wide range of military technologies that, while they did not alter the outcome of the war, were crucial for post-war technological development, especially in the emerging context of the Cold War and the growing confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. Hans Kammler was a key figure in this technological development process of Nazi Germany. From his offices in the SS Wirtschafts- und Verwaltungshauptamt, he designed and led the construction of many concentration and extermination camps, as well as the enormous crematorium buildings where millions of human lives were sacrificed. By mid-1943, after the Allied forces began bombing the regime's massive production complexes, Kammler was tasked with relocating them to underground bunkers, where Nazi scientists, engineers and technicians continued to develop technological programs, this time focusing on the production of new, ambitious and, in some cases, extravagant weapons. Kammler mysteriously disappeared at the end of the war, giving rise to numerous theories about his fate. Some believe he was captured by the Allies and secretly transferred to the United States under Operation Paperclip. Others claim he was executed or committed suicide to avoid capture. The lack of conclusive evidence about his fate has fueled speculation, making Kammler a near-mythical figure in World War II narratives. His story represents one of the darkest and most enigmatic chapters of the Second World War. The V-2 and the Me-262, the first long-range ballistic missile and the first jet fighter, respectively, reflect both the ingenuity and the desperation of the Nazi regime. Under Kammler's direction and the technical genius of Werner von Braun, both devices, along with many others, became a reality, but at an incalculable human cost. Thousands of concentration camp prisoners died during their construction, victims of the inhumane working conditions in the underground factories designed by Kammler. Despite being true innovations in military technology, the Wunderwaffe failed to change the course of the war, mainly due to delays in their production and the logistical problems Germany faced in the final years of the conflict. In many cases, the capabilities of these weapons were exaggerated to maintain enthusiasm among the population and the armed forces as part of a propaganda campaign led by Joseph Goebbels. The role played by the Todt Organization, on the other hand, is a clear reflection of the Nazi regime's desperation and its need to channel all available resources into the war effort. In the early 1940s, the organization, which had previously been dedicated to building roads and bridges, was forced to focus on armament development through slave labor. Its founder also died under extremely mysterious circumstances, and his story, along with Kammler's, is one of the most enigmatic left behind by World War II. The uranium project, meanwhile, represented the Nazi regime's effort to develop an atomic bomb. Following the discovery of nuclear fission in Berlin in 1938, attempts to construct weapons based on a chain nuclear reaction multiplied, and all world powers embarked on efforts to achieve this. Nazi Germany was no exception. However, the project was hampered by several factors: funding cuts in the context of the economic crisis brought on by the war, constant bombings and espionage missions by Allied forces to halt the program, and the brain drain that occurred once the Nazi Party began to interfere in the lives of various scientists and technicians who had the necessary knowledge to carry it out. Despite the rumors spread at the time, the Nazi regime was far from being able to produce an atomic bomb similar to those the United States dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. After the fall of the Nazi regime, the victorious powers rushed to recruit scientists and capture the technology developed under the Third Reich. Operation Paperclip, carried out by the United States, and Operation Osoaviakhim, conducted by the Soviet Union, are examples of how both countries fiercely competed in the context of the Cold War to acquire German scientific and technical knowledge and use it to develop their own advanced technology programs. These operations not only brought Nazi scientists like Wernher von Braun to the United States and the Soviet Union, where they played a crucial role in the space race, but also raised profound ethical questions. Was it justifiable, after all, to grant asylum and employment to individuals who had collaborated with a genocidal regime in exchange for their knowledge? The technological advances achieved by the Nazis were ultimately crucial for subsequent technological development, but were attained at an unprecedented human sacrifice. Due not only to what happened during the war, but also to what occurred afterward in the context of the US-Soviet rivalry. The story of Hans Kammler and the Wunderwaffe remains one of the darkest and most mysterious chapters of World War II.